Memento, Inception, Interstellar, Tenet, and the 3 movies in which Christian Bale plays Batman. You've probably been to see some of those movies, and you may have walked out thinking, especially in the case of those first 4, I didn't really get it. Which is one of several possible reactions to a Christopher Nolan movie. When you add it all up, though, Nolan has dominated film artistry and the box office like no other cinematic creator here in the 21st century. So we're going to talk about him today. He's not on the show. He doesn't do stuff like that. And even if he did stuff like that, I don't think he'd do it with us. But there are some people who know what they're talking about, and they're going to talk to us. Hello, and welcome to another of something that we've kind of made a habit of doing in recent years, or perhaps, I don't know how long we've been doing it, because basically I'm in a Christopher Nolan movie, and time has been cut up into different strands and chopped back together and tied in lanyards. It could be that I'm doing this show before we did the shows about the Coen brothers and Hitchcock. Well, never mind. See, this is the kind of trouble you get into right away, just right away without even meaning to. All right, so here to help us talk about Christopher Nolan, including reminding some of you who he is, are 2 guests who I am very excited to have. James Hanley is the co-founder of Cinestudio at Trinity College, where I have seen more than one Christopher Nolan movie. I don't really actually know how many Christopher Nolan movies I've seen, and this time I'm not being, coy or anything. I really don't know how many of them I've seen there, but a bunch of them, I'm sure. And joining us also, Tom Shone, who's the film critic for the Sunday Times and the author of 5 books. His latest is The Nolan Variations, The Movies, Mysteries, and Marvels of Christopher Nolan. And a little bit later in the show, we're going to talk to Kayleigh Donaldson. There are issues that kind of come up around, A, women in Nolan movies, and B, the way in which a certain portion of the Nolan fan base reacts to criticism. Being a friend of the film critic David Edelstein, I've actually lived through one of those episodes, and I can tell you, it is not pleasant. All right, Tom Shone, first of all, welcome. The book is a lot of fun, and you learn not only about Christopher Nolan movies, but about all the movies that Christopher Nolan watched in order to become Christopher Nolan, and that was a lot of fun as well. One of the things that you're essentially making is a case for Nolan as possibly the dominant film auteur of the 21st century in terms of commercial success, in terms of critical accolades, but make that case or make some kind of case for Nolan as an important standalone topic.
Sure. I mean, the filmmaker he reminded me of a little was Hitchcock. And there's a tendency, I think, with the filmmakers that are super successful commercially in their lifetimes to become almost a little bit invisible. They're hidden in plain sight. And I think that the same is true of Nolan. I think that there's a sense that, because he doesn't really need film critics, because the films, have such an immediate and, loyal fan base, there's a sense that, he doesn't really sort of need the praise from people. You know what I mean? That he doesn't get the attention or the depth of attention anyway that certain other filmmakers get. So that, for me, was the fun of writing the book, was here he is right under everybody's nose, and yet, curiously, I think that his, critics loved Inception, I think, but people are a little sniffy about him. I think that was what interested me. But the fan base is hugely loyal. So, I was trying to sort of split the difference or start up a conversation between those two. As to where he is, he's kind of like the Kubrick of the multiplex, is how I think of him. It's a different era now, isn't it? So it's the audience is younger. It's a different type of cinema going. But I think, he fits into that. He seems to me to be the kind of descendant of filmmakers like Hitchcock and Fritz Lang and Kubrick.
Right. Just to remind people, we are talking about the director auteur who created. I'm back in the filmography section of the book itself. It kind of starts with Memento and on to the English-speaking version of Insomnia, Batman Begins, The Prestige, The Dark Knight, Inception, The Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar, Dunkirk, Tenet, and more to come, certainly. So, James, since I do go to your movie theater a lot, imagine that I were standing out there in the lobby and about to go in to watch a showing of Tenet at Trinity Cinestudio, and I was saying, I never get these movies. I feel like I have to go talk to 5 people afterwards and do a lot of homework. And, I don't know. I'm just kind of tempted to go home and put on Chinatown or something and watch it again. I don't know. So James, make the case for me to go in and tackle Tenet, assuming I've never seen it before, which of course I have. But what would you say to me?
Well, I'd say the first thing probably is completely clear your mind of expectations and actual sort of, like for instance, you mentioned Chinatown, which everybody knows as a story, who anybody in film knows as a story. And it's a very satisfying film with a very accessible story and great performances. Christopher Nolan, to me, the very first thing I saw of his, which happened to be Memento, then I went back and saw some of his earlier things too, is that it's really an intellectual and actually in some levels an emotional challenge that your previous experience with cinema does not necessarily apply. And I remember thinking exactly the same thing when I first saw 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Just what do you think you're doing, Dave? I really think I'm entitled to an answer to that question. Look, Dave, I can see you're really upset about this. I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over. Dave, stop. I'm afraid. I'm afraid, Dave.
Kubrick was somebody who was like, he spent his whole time making that film fighting with MGM, and MGM execs were coming to see the dailies of the film, and they say, what the hell is it about? Tell us what it is, because we don't know, nobody's going to understand this. And I think that what I would say to you going into Tenet, for example, is that if you clear your mind and think, well, actually, if you wanted to describe it, yes, it's an action film perhaps, but it's also an intellectual challenge. It's a puzzle. It's an extraordinarily intricate coming together of somebody's ideas, but also a visual sense that is very innovative. And so it's exciting to me and a challenge on every level. And that's what I would say. Prepare yourself for a ride, but don't have expectations. Just really clear your mind. And then I think you can really have this extraordinary experience.
One of these bullets is like us, traveling forwards through time. The other one's going backwards. Can you tell which is which? How about now? It's inverted. Its entropy runs backwards, so to our eyes its movement is reversed. We think it's a type of inverse radiation triggered by nuclear fission.
You didn't make it?
We don't know how yet.
So where did it come from?
Someone's manufacturing them in the future. They're streaming back at us. Try it.
How can it move before I touch it?
From your point of view, you caught it. But from the bullet's point of view, you dropped it.
But cause comes before effect.
No, that's just the way we see time.
Well, what about free will?
That bullet wouldn't have moved if you hadn't put your hand there. Either way we run the tape, you made it happen. Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it. Tom Shone, in a way, that does sound a little bit like Nolan saying more or less what James said when James said, clear your mind.
Sure. I was just actually thinking of the added challenge there of hearing the dialogue without seeing
yes.
the bullets flying up. I mean, the thing I'll sort of add to that is that for Nolan, it essentially comes from, the idea of the film was a very sort of visceral one. In other words, it wasn't an idea. It was a sort of fascination he had, that his eye had, looking at either sort of when they first discovered slow-mo and started using that. I think it was the 84 Olympics when they first started seeing that on sort of network TV. And then also sort of backwards, footage. And he just found himself fascinated by that. And it's a very visceral fascination, like it's sort of not an idea so much as it is a feeling. And I think the kind of the film, for me, sort of shares that, the idea of and the sight of things flowing backwards never quite lost its kind of appeal. I mean, it's used actually quite limitedly in the film. There's not that much of it, and I think it's used sparingly. So I think that was the thrill for him, and then trying to construct a plot around it that hopefully made sense.
James, one of the things that jumped out at me in Tom's book is, on the one hand, he begins by talking about this century and how, in fact, we have been transformed digitally. We have been transformed through the internet so that you are not so much bound by the place that you're sitting in. You're not so much bound by time. People just don't see a necessity to see a thing as it happens. It's just infinitely available to them. There are so many different ways in which, as Tom says, we are living in a Christopher Nolan film. And then I was sort of surprised to find out a few pages later that Nolan doesn't really participate in very much of that stuff. He does not own a smartphone or a cell phone. He doesn't have an email account. And, the description of how he makes movies, including having the cast and crew in to look at the rushes every day and stuff, it really sounds rather old-fashioned. And I'm thinking of you, James, as someone who loves movies and has loved movies over the decades and decades, and wondering if one of the things you like about Nolan is not how beautifully modern he is, but how, in fact, he does seem to come from an earlier time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think of him as grounded in that sense, and I share that myself. I mean, I'm not a sort of very frequent participant, shall we say, in things like, I'm not on Facebook, and I don't spend a lot of time with social media, and I actually find myself, when I find myself lost in a film like Tenet or Interstellar, I find that is a very profound sort of basic sort of sense of where I started with my fascination with film. When I first saw This Is Cinerama when I was 7 years old, it was a sensation to me, a feeling that I never forgot.
You are about to see the first public exhibition of an entirely new form of entertainment. We call it Cinerama. It's a novelty, but it's far more than that. It's the latest development in the magic of light and sound. In fact, it is the first public demonstration of an entirely new medium, which we believe is going to revolutionize the technique of motion picture storytelling. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cinerama.
And of course, I went on to see many, many films and sort of found it so extraordinary to be drawn into those things, drawn into the art of the film, but also the ideas that were coming across and the person who was making it. And it seems to me that Christopher Nolan is the kind of person who, by his very sort of distance from the sort of modern era, if you like, of communication and shared experience and time dilation of events being experienced in different things, all the things you described, he has a sort of almost a visceral sense of a foundation, if you will, that I feel that he's reading and he's fascinated with ideas and the communications he has with his brother, and the films he's interested in. It's almost like going back to the beginning, for me, going back to the beginning of Cinestudio and why I wanted to be part of opening a theater and bringing people films, everything from Italian neorealism to Kubrick and everything else, that it was that sort of basic feeling. And it is a kind of going back. It's a kind of grounding. I mean, I think Christopher Nolan really, I agree with Tom that I can't think of anyone else actually who's quite like that. I mean, you can compare him to Hitchcock and to Kubrick, but it's like Christopher Nolan is a new event, if you like, appearing in the midst of this new universe that is so exhausting and infuriating to a lot of people. But here in the midst of it is a man of ideas and image, and bringing symphonic music tracks to films that start at the beginning of the film and don't end till the end. It's all part of one, a sort of new understanding, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, there's some people who would include Nolan in the exhausting and frustrating category, and I would imagine that we will come to that. Although, Tom Shone, I think one of the things that your book does to startle someone like me, I've seen all these movies. I'm not a Christopher Nolan fan. That's probably already come across a little bit. I mean, I'm not a Christopher Nolan hater either, exactly. But he wouldn't be like a defining filmmaker for me. But one of the things that I realized the minute I entered the world of your book is how little Nolan is known. I mean, we talk about Hitchcock. Well, you couldn't get away from Hitchcock the person. I mean, he hid a lot of things about who he really was. But you're really seeing him all the time. And Tarantino, that is certainly the case. But, even compared to like the Coen brothers or Wes Anderson or pick some directors, there's a way in which Nolan, except for what's in your book, is, I think, been deliberately kind of unknowable, kind of pulling himself out of the normal publicity stream, even as he creates an oeuvre, which you argue is in some ways about him, an oeuvre in which he inhabits, I think you say, every frame.
Yeah. I mean, listen, you've identified like the central kind of fault line of the book, and the number of battles that we had, with me essentially trying to convince him that there was something personally expressive about these films. I mean, Nolan has kind of perfected the art of sort of talking about his films while revealing nothing about himself, as you point out. I think he sort of said to me at one point, I must be the most readily available reclusive director in America. He has this sort of aura of somebody who is sort of removed from the fray and doesn't do publicity, but he's out there kind of promoting the films, but he just never reveals much about himself. And when I first saw Memento, I just knew that film came from the very center of whoever made it. It just, to me, had the sort of impress, the feeling of like a personal film. I don't mean it was autobiographical, but I just meant that it was very personal.
Are you sure you want this?
Have I told you what this man did?
Yeah.
Well, then you shouldn't have to ask.
But even if you get revenge, you're not going to remember it. You're not even going to know that it happened.
My wife deserves vengeance. Doesn't make any difference whether I know about it. Just because there are things I don't remember doesn't make my actions meaningless. The world doesn't just disappear when you close your eyes, does it?
And so when I first approached him to do the book, one of the first things he said to me was that, don't put me on the psychiatrist's couch. Don't try and explain the films by, reference to my life or, me even. So I had to do a kind of funny thing, which was respect that while also sort of persuade him that these films were incredibly distinctive, right? They don't resemble anybody else's. They only resemble his films. And B, personal to him. That in other words, even though they're these big kind of commercial successes, they are also a form of expression, artistic expression. And weirdly, he had a kind of resistance to that. I think obviously it's nice to be called an artist. It's nice to be said that, your work is art. But on the other hand, he doesn't particularly like the kind of spotlight into like him, his life and so on. So there was an odd balance there. But yeah, that's the fault line, and we waged many, many, many battles over that one.
Right. So yeah, no creator wants to be autobiographical, and they all fight that, even when they clearly are. It's a little bit different here. I mean, he really is not particularly visible, except that we're all doing these very human things. And since you're mentioning Memento, James talked about Memento as his on ramp, as it was for many, many people. Life is kind of lived forward but understood backwards. No matter who you are, there's a way in which the past, and the older you get, the more you're kind of palpating that past and kind of going backwards through it, trying to understand how you get to be where you are. That's what's happening to Leonard, the character played by Guy Pearce. So, James, you said that Memento made you even go and seek out earlier, less well-marketed films by Christopher Nolan. But I don't know, what is Memento to you? What is it that made you have that reaction?
I think it was a sense of excitement that it was like, first of all, it kind of baffled me afterwards, and then I had to go and see it again. And I think it was the excitement of feeling the challenge of a really, really different kind of film. And audiences that I saw it with, you could feel that half the audience was like, wanted to know more. They wanted to figure this out, and they wanted to see, what you just raised about the whole sense of things going backwards and how you understand your life, and understanding the sort of progressive narrative of a story suddenly being turned on its head and actually causing you to think differently.
Well, that's the thing. I have this condition.
A condition?
It's my memory.
Amnesia?
No. It's different from that. I have no short-term memory. I know who I am. I know all about myself. Since my injury, I can't make new memories. Everything fades. If we talk for too long, I'll forget how we started. And next time I see you, I'm not going to remember this conversation. I don't even know if I've met you before. So if I seem a little strange or rude or something, I've told you this before, haven't I?
Yeah, I don't mean to mess with you, but it's so weird. You don't remember me at all.
No.
We've talked a bunch of times.
I'm sure we have, yeah.
Well, what's the last thing you remember?
My wife.
What's it like?
It's like waking. It's like you just woke up.
That must suck. It's all backwards,
It was like the nexus of it felt like the next of film, if you like. It was that exciting to me. And I felt the closest thing, strangely enough, maybe not strangely, was when I saw 2001 in a complete print the first time. It was like, wait a minute, I need to go back and see it again, and I need to somehow formulate my understanding of it, and also realizing the fluidity of that there was no answer and there was no clear understanding. And I think that that's something that's very daring for a filmmaker to get into, and obviously very threatening to film producers, I think, the idea that you could throw stuff out there and it might not be understood by everybody. And certainly in the case of Memento, everybody, all the insiders, I think I seem to remember stories in the press then about how it was so hard to get it out there. It finally gets out there, and it actually, against all odds, as a kind of quirky art film, it becomes a big success. People in the industry, especially the majors, didn't know what to make of it. I mean, I can remember having conversations with major distributors that we book with all the time. They say, can you explain to me what's going on with Memento? Why are people going to see that film? It's like, really? How could this be? And it was that very thing that excited me, that difference, that newness, that idea that you're pre-arranged sort of sense of what cinema was and how you understood it visually and intellectually was somehow, there was a seismic shift.
Tom, in the book, well, first of all, to James's point, in the book, Soderbergh is quoted as saying, this is an incredible movie. If it can't get made, if it can't get released, if it can't get marketed, that means we're dead. We're just, the film is not going to be in good shape. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen, But Nolan says an interesting thing, which is that this was sort of a time when there were a lot of movies playing around with the idea that this is not your little life. And whether it's The Matrix, The Fight Club, The Sixth Sense, these are all movies that I think Nolan cites, and now Memento, and a number of the Nolan movies that would follow, there was suddenly an interest in having movies in which there was a central question about whether the reality being depicted on face value was in fact arguable reality. And in that sense, he's more of part of a movement than an outlier.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking, well, why is that? What was in the water that part of the decade? I mean, to me, I could only really explain it by sort of drawing way back and just kind of looking at the fact that with the arrival of the internet and computer technology, and the information age, we've just gone through this huge historical convulsion, and we're still trying to find our feet. And for me, at least, that was kind of what I think people were tapping into, is that sense of disorientation, the floor disappearing from under your feet. And sort of Memento and The Matrix and all those other movies to some extent are dramatizing that. It's curious. I mean, he isn't fond of the internet particularly. He's he's less in love with technology than you'd imagine, a director like that to be. But it gives him this great outside perspective, I think, on that huge upheaval. You were talking about the difficulty of it getting released. It's so funny. That reminded me of one of the main things that I found attractive about the films, which was I just found the word anomalous kept on coming up. I was thinking, God, the movies are anomalous. His success is anomalous. I find it much easier to imagine a universe in which Memento was a small art house hit.
Yeah.
And it led to a series of small movies that he scrambled to get funding for, complicated, ambiguous, all the things that, producers hate. And yet somehow they're out there and they're the most popular films of the year and they're earning billions of dollars. That to me is the exciting thing about him. How is that? There's something very unlikely about it. I always think if aliens came down and sort of said, his career would be the one that would be the most difficult to explain. Why isn't this guy an art house filmmaker? Why? How has this happened?
Well, let's grab a little break here. We're talking to James Hanley, co-founder of Cinestudio at Trinity College, Tom Shone, a film critic for the Sunday Times, and the author, most recently, of the Nolan Variations, the movies, mysteries, and marvels of Christopher Nolan. We'll be back. We've got to talk about this Batman fellow.
What's the point? Far out there when the structures fail you, when the rules aren't weapons anymore, they're shackles, letting the bad guy get ahead. One day, you may face such a moment of crisis, and in that moment, I hope you have a friend like I did. To plunge their hands into the filth, so that you can keep yours clean.
Your hands look plenty filthy to me, Commissioner.
That's Gary Oldman as Commissioner Gordon, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Blake. So we're talking to James Hanley, co-founder of Cinestudio at Trinity College, Tom Shone, film critic for the Sunday Times. His newest book is The Nolan Variations, the movies, mysteries, and marvels of Christopher Nolan. So this is a very difficult subject to get into, I think, because, Batman is certainly there before Christopher Nolan comes along, and he's there in a lot of different manifestations. There have been, in the comic books, different interpretations of him on other movies made with other Batmans. And yet Nolan seems to make a really remarkable set of choices about what he's going to do with Batman. And maybe, Tom, you can just sort of get us going. Talk about how you see maybe the fundamental choice or two that Nolan decides on.
Yeah, I think the fundamental choice that he made was, he didn't want to make a comic book superhero movie, basically. That's how I see it. The material was a superhero in a comic book, but the gift of Batman, if you like, is that he's probably the closest to a kind of mere mortal in that he doesn't have superpowers. He's, just a man who dresses up in a cape and so on. So that put him within the wheelhouse of a more straightforward action movie, firstly. But I think also he just wanted to remove some of the shine from the superhero movie so that you came out thinking not, oh, that was a really good superhero movie, but, oh, that was just a really good movie. And so he wanted it to compete with the very best action thrillers that he had seen. I think it actually does more than that, to tell the truth. I think it probably is better than even kind of most action thrillers. But that was the basic starting point. It's how can we make the absurdity of a man who dresses up in a cape every night, how can we make that real?
But at the time of Dark Knight Rises, he has thoroughly succeeded in removing the shine anyway. And I did see that, James, in your movie theater. And I remember just walking around thinking, this is like messing up my blood pressure and stuff. I'm just like, this is so, there's something so despairing about this whole narrative. But I want to talk, I actually want to talk about the middle one, The Dark Knight. And James, I think you and Tom and I could have an interesting conversation about whether Christopher Nolan has a sense of humor, whether he could ever make a comedy, whether we would want to see the comedy that he made. But there's a way in which the performance by Heath Ledger as the Joker is this just remarkable thing. I mean, it's not a comic performance exactly, but I actually had this experience of watching the movie, I think at Cinestudio, and suddenly imagining that if I looked down the aisle of seats, the row of seats that I was sitting in, the Joker might be sitting down there and kind of looking at me and laughing at me, you know, and that I would find that very unsettling. There's a way in which he somehow or other achieves a kind of sort of meta status or a superiority to the narrative that I don't think I've ever seen in anything like this before. But James, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, I first of all, I think generally taking on the Batman series and turning it into something almost like an academic psychological treatise in a way that underpins what's going on in all of the films. But I think that in his connection, Christopher Nolan's connection with Heath Ledger and the Joker character is like, there's a really serious dark humor to it. I can't quite describe anything that I've seen in cinema, that moment when he turns around and clicks the cell phone and blows the hospital up. I mean, that is like, I just think of the Warner's executives seeing that and, not being able to stop it. It's like, one of the things that Nolan has done is this extraordinarily, this sort of pirouette, if you like, of taking intellect and then talking these major funders, these big distributors, into making films that stand not only as as tentpoles in the market that make lots of money, but also have real substance to them. And I think that the middle of the triad of Batman films, it really gets to the heart of that it's actually can be parsed as a serious film. It's really extraordinary to think of that I had trouble persuading some people to see that film because the immediate assumption was, well, action film, superhero film, it'll be a bore. But actually, it's got layer upon layer, and it's a real thing that you can take apart. You can go and see it several times, and you can take a character like the Joker who becomes a real sort of philosophical treatise about what happens. Where is this person coming from? How could he be like this? And in the case of Heath Ledger, about his connection to Heath Ledger even, it was an extraordinary intensity to me that this was able to happen in what was seen as a mainstream film.
Those mob fools want you gone so they can get back to the way things were. But I know the truth. There's no going back. You've changed things. Forever.
Then why do you want to kill me?
I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No. You complete me.
You're garbage. You kills for money.
Don't talk like one of them. You're not. Even if you'd like to be. To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. But when they don't, they'll cast you out. Like a leper. See, their morals, their code. It's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
My producer, Jonathan McPants, is pointing out that it's a wonderful thing that the Joker has seen Jerry Maguire. So,
and just one final thing in taking the trilogy. I mean, rumor had it, I heard from people I talked to at Warner Brothers that they were having trouble getting Christopher Nolan to agree to the third film. And what he wanted was a guarantee that he could make Inception. And they wanted him, of course, they got him. And then they had this idea. I remember talking to the booker for Inception. I say, well, this is really, it's kind of out there. It's just up your street. It's an art film. And of course, it wasn't an art film. It was a huge success also. And this was like an affirmation of the process that was happening in the Batman films, this bringing in of a serious intellectual and I think emotional underpinning that made these layered films so fascinating to watch and to watch again.
So I want to, first of all, just kind of double down on what both of you just said, and particularly Tom saying, that he really wanted to make a series of movies that were not simply superhero movies, that were just movies that happen to have superheroes in them. And I think that's sort of borne out. Not that the Oscars is particularly meaningful, but I think we all understand that the reason that the Oscars wound up expanding their best film category to include more movies and a chance to have more kinds of movies was the feeling afterwards that the fact that The Dark Knight had not been nominated in that category was a problem, that there was something deeply wrong with failing to acknowledge it that way. So, there's so much to say, and we are in a Christopher Nolan fashion, kind of short on time here, but maybe the thing to say kind of overarchingly that you could talk about, Tom, Shone, is there's a way in which the world building in all of these movies is so extreme. I mean, in most of the movies that we're talking about, whether it's Interstellar or Inception or Tenet or Dunkirk, these are worlds. I mean, Dunkirk's a historical reality, but these other things, these are worlds that kind of have to be built for the purpose of the movie. And I think I would argue that even with these Batman movies, he really has to build a world that is very, very different from any Batman world that we've ever seen before. And so that might be why we're talking about a dominating filmmaker in terms of what? He's got 12 movies, right? I mean, he says in your book, it's really hard for me to make movies. There's no way I'm ever going to make another movie just to get another movie made. But could you say a bit more about just sort of, he's not Hitchcock in that sense, I think. He's not just going to pump them out.
No, sure. I mean, the world building thing is really, it gets, I think, to the sort of heart of why he makes movies. I mean, he always describes like going to see 2001 when he was a kid and like the sense of just complete transport that he got from that, and the films do invite you into this world. I mean, the interesting thing about The Dark Knight is that it's actually a much smaller movie than the first film geographically, and it's just set within the city, mostly Gotham. I think they go abroad to Hong Kong once, but the idea that like by constricting the world, bringing the world in tighter, but the film feels big. It feels bigger than the first film. So that's a paradox. It's kind of like it's very peculiar, but that kind of is very much where he's sort of at, in terms of getting the films made. I mean, yes, he's sort of, it's certainly, he's the only, I think, I guess you could say, James Cameron, maybe Peter Jackson, both of them to some degree have kind of almost retired not entirely, but they seem like they've kind of ascended to the next level. But Nolan is one of the few film directors who can kind of walk into a studio and say, here's my new idea, and then they'll give him however many hundred millions of dollars to go make it. There is this sort of degree of trust. He's built this relationship with Warner Brothers, and that's interesting, James, about the idea that it was with the promise of the third Dark Knight film that he got Inception made. Certainly, the fact that The Dark Knight made I think it was the first to make $1 billion. That also opened the way to Inception.
What is the most resilient parasite? Bacteria? A virus? An intestinal worm?
What Mr. Cobb is trying to say?
An idea. Resilient, highly contagious. Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks. Right in there somewhere.
For someone like you to steal?
Yes, in the dream state, your conscious defenses are lowered and it makes your thoughts vulnerable to theft. It's called extraction.
Mr. Saito, we can train your subconscious to defend itself from even the most skilled extractor.
How can he do that?
Because I am the most skilled extractor.
I mean, it's a remarkable career, really. I mean, it's sort of, you kept on expecting a stumble. I mean, maybe the closest would be Tenet. I mean, people complained that they didn't understand bits of it. You know, like it's an amazing thing to have a studio that's essentially willing to kind of write a check for a movie that's as confounding as Tenet.
We're going to take a little break here. We've got one more segment to go. I'll be excited to add Kayleigh Donaldson, a pop culture writer and critic, to this conversation to talk about men and masculinity, women, and fans, all in the Nolan-verse.
Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien. Ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal. Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien.
We are back. It's time for me to thank Kat Pastor. She is our technical producer here. And, of course, Jonathan McPants is the person who envisioned this episode and pulled all of it together. We are talking about the work of Christopher Nolan, probably, arguably, the dominant cinematic auteur of the 21st century, at least in terms of critical accolades and commercial success. We've been talking to James Hanley and Tom Shone, who are still with us. We're very excited to add Kayleigh Donaldson, a pop culture writer and critic, to this conversation. And Kayleigh, some of what you want to talk about kind of springs off of the diving board of Dunkirk.
There's no hiding from this, son.
What is it you think you can do with that, on this thing?
There's not just us. The call went out. We aren't the only ones to answer, you know.
You don't even have guns.
You have a gun?
Yes, of course. A rifle, a 303.
Did it help you against the dive bombers and the U-boats?
You're an old fool. I'm not going back. I'm not going back. Turn it around.
I'm not turning around.
Turn it around! Turn it around! Calm it down, mate!
So, Kayleigh, there's so many things going on even in that clip, and kind of an inversion of our standard boilerplate understanding of war movie heroism. The soldier is very afraid. The civilian seems to be calm and composed, as only Mark Rylance can be, I guess. So say more about what you're extracting from all that.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I think that Dunkirk is Nolan's best film is it has this incredible understanding of masculinity, particularly the most damaged version of it that takes place in wartime. I remember when the film came out and there were some of the kind of usual criticisms that Nolan gets. The big one he's always had throughout his career is that he's not great at writing women, and there aren't any women in this film at all, which I actually think is to the benefit of it, because I agree it's not his strongest point. But here you really get to see him focus in on these themes that he is so adept at. And this is a story all about, it's basically dissecting the Great War myth. One of the great moments in that film comes at the end where you hear that iconic Churchill speech. And in the final shot of the film, it cuts back to one of the soldiers who's just gotten off of the beach of Dunkirk having this 2-second realization, oh, I have to go back. And this doesn't end for me. There's no glory in that moment. It's not a film that pumps up war as this great moment. It's a story all about how it destroys the lives of, to the leaders of the world, thousands, millions of faceless boys, essentially. The film mostly focuses on a group of young men who kind of all look the same and all look about 17 years old. And I think that that's so powerful. That's where I really think it's the best thing he's ever done.
You know, one of the things that struck me about that movie, and James, I think we talked about it on the show, was that what he didn't do was have sort of the really big flotilla moment. And there wasn't sort of this kind of huge array of boats with some massive Elgar score playing in the background. He kind of ducked away from what you would expect to see on a big screen in a story like that one.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that I sort of agree about Dunkirk actually being a very significant film. I don't know. For me, Interstellar is one of the most provocative films, perhaps the top for me.
I've waited years.
How many years?
By now it must be.
It's 23 years, 4 months, 8 days.
But it was
prepared. I knew the theory. Reality's different.
I learned what I could from the black hole. But I couldn't send anything to your father. We've been receiving, but nothing gets out.
Is he alive?
Oh, yeah. We've got years of messages stored. Cooper.
Messages span 23 years.
Play it from the beginning.
But Dunkirk, I think, is fascinating because it actually brings the focus of war and this sort of using boys as fodder, really, and the distance from a sort of human reality of all of these people being killed and the inescapability of the hazard that they face and the whole nature of why wars occur and how they require, it's kind of like, you buy the tree chopping machine and trees are going to get chopped. You have all of the armaments, and so people are going to die. There's going to be a war. And somehow Christopher Nolan manages in Dunkirk to make it almost in that huge IMAX image, actually makes it so intimate and so precise about character and about people and about the illusions of masculinity, actually, and masculinity as it's used in war.
One of the points that Kayleigh makes so well is that this is his empathy movie. This is this movie, if you are concerned about whether Christopher Nolan has feelings and is in touch with them, maybe this is the place that happens. Kayleigh, our time is short, but you really brought up another thing, which I've kind of experienced at the side of somebody going through it, which is what it's like for a critic who writes something negative about a Nolan movie. There is a group of Nolan fans, kind of ninja geeks, who will really go after you just over a negative review, right?
Yeah, he certainly inspires a level of fervor that I find quite fascinating. I think it's partly because, you have to go back to the Batman films he made. He was the filmmaker that for a whole generation of geeks, for lack of a better term, it's such a broad term now, really made superhero movies and comic book films seem legitimate, seem like a very serious topic for very serious filmmakers. You still see the shadow of, especially The Dark Knight. We had that Joker film a couple of years ago, which didn't even come close to what Nolan did. And I think for a lot of fans, there is something really powerful about Nolan doing that. He's also one of the few filmmakers who can get a massive $200 million film made based on his name alone. Even Spielberg has trouble with that nowadays. And I think that there is something about that inspires a kind of, adoration, because he is really standing at the top of a very tall pile right now. It's weird to be on the other end of, because, for all the things I've said, Nolan is not a scrappy underdog. So it's very strange to see him be defended as such. But I sort of understand the mindset, even if I think, maybe they should all chill a bit, because Nolan seems like a really chill guy. I don't think he'd be for all of that.
Well, actually, this is a good place for us to end. Yeah. To me, by the way, just being an adult means reading a review of a movie that you liked that's a negative review and being intrigued if the writer is making. I remember having that experience with Schindler's List and reading Leon Wieseltier's takedown of it and thinking, wow, I just had never thought about it that way. That's really interesting. Tom Shone, yes, we only have about a minute left, but it does seem like this ferocious group of sometimes even death threat making Nolan defenders are nothing like the man you describe in the book.
Yeah, it's he's really got a kind of cult reputation. That's the only way to describe it, a kind of mass cult. The thing it reminds me of a little bit is kind of, his stories of when he was growing up and how important escape was to him. He went to this sort of very tough sort of boarding school, and he would sort of entertain himself late at night after the lights were out in his dorm, essentially with a kind of personal cinema show in his own head, concocting stories using his Sony Walkman to kind of, prompt the sort of, the musical cues, a bit like Edith Piaf in Inception. And it really struck me how important that escape impulse is to him. His characters aren't just trying to escape reality. Their lives depend on their ability to escape reality. It's intolerable to them, and I think that to some extent he's captured that
The Nolan Variations, the movies, mysteries, and marvels of Christopher Nolan is Tom Shone's book. Read it, go see a movie at Trinity Cinestudio, and make sure you keep up with the work of Kayleigh Donaldson, pop culture writer and critic.
Moving verse on my turf, I'm out of line. I put in work, I draw the line and cross it first. I need the time, I need the search. It's just like wine and make it work. Skirt, skirt, in a verse. Skirt, skirt, run a land. Boeing jet, make it land. It's slow motion when I dance. In your eyes, I see your trance. I run away and then you prance. If I show the hideaway, will you hide out and let it blam? Ain't no time, I face the scams. I know.